Hello, everyone. I have not shared my screen on my iPad, so let me see if, is this working? Can you guys see my screen? Okay, cool. Let me find my Canva. And let me see if I can figure out how to get it into presentation mode. Yes, all right. Oh, hold on, my bad. I like to be able to see you guys as I talk. Hold on. Okay. Alrighty, so thank you so much, Sister Otey and the Georgia Green Project for having me today. It truly is an honor to be able to share space with you all. So before we jump into the presentation, I like to give everyone a moment to just take some nice deep breaths. You can close your eyes if you're in a safe space to do that, just so that you can really allow yourself and give yourself permission to be in this space fully and be fully present. If you don't have a notebook, feel free to grab that and some pen or a pen, and we'll go ahead and get started. So what we'll talk about today is who Princess Gardens Worm Farm is as a company and the work that we do. We'll talk about vermicomposting and what that is and what that looks like for the at-home gardener. We'll talk about its benefits. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between vermicompost and your typical compost that people like to do. We'll talk about how you can get started and all the different components that you need. And then I threw in a few different little tips and reminders that I like to tell people about, and we'll talk about that at the end. Also, a short disclaimer, I did have to attend a convention with my baby, so I'm like in a quiet space, but if you guys hear people in the background, I apologize in advance. All right, so who we are as a company, Princess Gardens. I started Princess Gardens back in 2009. And it just started as a way for me to, I was putting together little gardening kits for, first I did it for my baby who is now 16. But then I started putting them together for kids that were in the classes that I worked at a child care center. So putting those together for them so that they could get out in nature, get their hands in the soil and learn how to grow and produce food for themselves. So, so yes, that's how we got started. And it has evolved into a full-scale small composting center. We started vermicomposting we added vermicomposting to Princess Gardens in 2018. And from there, we just kind of grew into who we are now as a company. Our mission is to assist households, businesses, organizations, and the community in general. We want to help them to divert organic matter using vermicomposting. We also strive to educate our youth and teach them sustainable lifestyle practices. We want to teach them how to connect with nature and heal through nature. And we want to create self-sufficiency through horticulture. We are 100% Black women owned and operated. We do internships, mentorships, and we do focus on mentoring and interning with people of color. All right, so let's get into it. If you guys have questions, I guess since I'm not gonna really be able to see your questions, if you wanna leave them in the chat, or you can also just write them down, and I've left some time open for like a Q&A session. So if you guys have questions, then yeah. We'll talk about them at the end. So what exactly is vermicomposting? Vermicomposting is the process of composting, but we added worms into the mix. So taking organic material and using worms and their process to break down that organic material. Vermicomposting is a closed loop renewable process, and it helps us to regenerate communities, homes, businesses, and our environment. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of vermicomposting. There are so many, but I've created this little slide to kind of give you guys a few. So in the garden specifically, vermicomposting is going to help you to build a very healthy soil that is going to make growing your food optimal. So it's going to help with soil retention. It's going to help to build up that soil structure itself. Not only that, but adding vermicast into your soil is going to add a little bit of food for your plants to take up as they need it. It's a slow release fertilizer for your plants. And the beautiful thing about vermicast is that the nutrients that it offers into your soil for your plants to uptake is that nutrients is readily available. Whereas sometimes when you add other organic amendments, those organic amendments have to go through the process of being broken down by the microbial life within the soil. So vermicast is a great amendment to add a little bit of that NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's also going to add some trace minerals and things like that. It's also going to help your garden to be pest resistant. It helps with, like I said, the soil structure. So it's going to help with moisture retention, which is super important for specific areas like here in Colorado, where it is incredibly dry. The vermicast really helps to build up that soil structure so that the soil is able to retain more moisture. So when we look at how vermicomposting benefits our environment, the planet, nature. So for one, it gives us a very easy way to divert our organic matter, which is one of the main causes for the release of greenhouse gases from like the common household and also certain industries in the business world. So it gives us the opportunity to divert our waste from the landfill. It's also going to help to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, which is one of the main reasons why it's super duper hot outside, because carbon is twice as hot as some of your other greenhouse gases. Oops. And then it also teaches us how to be good stewards over the land. And it teaches us that because it teaches us to be a little more mindful about the things that we're purchasing. So I know since I've started vermicomposting, I've become more mindful about not buying things that I don't need. The fabrics of the materials of the clothes that I purchase, I've tried to stay away from anything that is not going to break down in my vermicomposting bin. So I try to keep it close to cottons and different things like that to make sure that I'm being a good steward of the land. And then vermicomposting also calls us to spend time in nature. So when we go through, or my typical day as a worm farmer, I start my day out in nature, getting sunshine, because my worm farm is inside. I want to make sure that they are getting the vibe of outside nature. So I like to be as grounded and as energetically high vibrational, so that I'm bringing that same energy to the worms, so that they can in turn, I feel like they accept and receive and process the energy that I'm giving them, and that's what goes into our worm castings. So yes, vermicompost can also call us to be closer to nature and to spend more time in nature. And then lastly, how does vermicomposting help in the home? So overall, it's going to help by lowering your carbon footprint at home. Number one, you're not going to have as much of that organic matter that's going out into the landfill. So that's how it reduces your carbon footprint. It also reduces it because it calls us to be more mindful of our eating habits. So we're eating things that are from nature. We're growing our food, so we don't have to go to the grocery store as much. And although I still make my shopping trips to the grocery store, for example, we didn't have to purchase zucchini at the store last night because we got to harvest from our garden and eat it at home. Vermicomposting also, in my experience and the people that I've worked with through this work, it has increased our mindfulness, not just of nature, but for ourselves and how we show up in the world and how we show up for ourselves, calling us to eat better, calling us to stay away from the processed food. Vermicomposting also helps with reducing stress, not only because you're putting your hands into the soil and that microbial life and the different nutrients and things like that are entering your body through your skin, which is our biggest organ. It also helps us to reduce stress just because when you're interacting with organisms such as the worms and their ecosystem, there's just a certain energy that your worms are going to call forward in you. You're not going to be able to just handle them any kind of way. There's a certain level of respect and mindfulness that comes with vermicomposting. And so with that, from my experience, it helps with reducing stress. It helps with reducing anxiety and depression. To me, vermicomposting is kind of a space where you can go for meditative purposes, because there in that space, no matter how big or small your bin is, you're just in a certain level of ease when you're working with your worms. So those are the benefits of vermicomposting. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between composting, your typical everyday compost that most people know about, and then the differences between vermicomposting. So the major differences that you can note is number one, your typical composting requires quite a bit more space than your vermicompost. Vermicompost, in order to be successful at it, you don't need anything bigger than a shoebox size container for your worms. And then as you progress and get better at the process, you can grow your bin and your worm farm is going to grow and expand and things like that. Both of these processes are going to produce material that come from organic waste. Now, one of the benefits of using regular compost is that you can put pretty much any type of organic material. And when we talk about organic material, we're talking about anything that once had life. So that is you, that is me, although we probably won't be composted, but that is you, me, the birds in the sky, the trees, their leaves, the grass, the flowers, things that have life, is what we consider organic material. So looking at the differences, your typical compost, which is called a thermophilic compost, that is going to be a little bit more lenient in the things that you can add to it, whereas your vermicomposting system, you're going to have to be a little bit more mindful about what you're adding to your system, just because the worms, they don't like certain things like spicy foods. They tend to kind of stray away from your hot spicy peppers, your onions, things like that. Although you can add them, but um, your citrus fruits are going to be things that you have to be mindful of when you're using your vermicomposting system. Um, and so those are kind of the differences in that aspect. In my opinion, vermicomposting tends to be a more low maintenance process. And I say that because with your worms, you really kind of just get their bin set up, and then it's just like taking care of a pet. You go in there, you feed it, and then you just let the worms do what they do. Now, there will be different things that you have to kind of do in order to maintain your bin, but it's the maintenance on your worm bin, in your worm bin or your worm farm, is going to be much lower than your typical compost, where you have to go in there, monitor your temperature, turn your pile, shift your pile, and however that goes. So vermicompost, some of the other benefits of vermicomposting is that because it's a mesophilic process, which means it produces bacteria that can survive in the temperature ranges, more survivable for this beneficial bacteria and this different microbial life. You can use your vermicompost, or your vermicast is what the finished product is called. You can put that right into your garden after your worms have processed through the material. Whereas with your typical like hot compost, you have to wait for things to cool down and things like that. So that's kind of one of the things that separates vermicast from your typical compost. Both of these materials are going to help to nourish your garden. They're going to help to add different materials in there so that your garden can grow and thrive. When we think about like what's really a benefit that separates the two, is vermicast is going to be more beneficial because it has that microbiology in it. So when you're growing organically or naturally, the microbiology that is in the vermicast or your vermicompost is what's going to go into your garden and then continue to break down organic material. It's going to be what helps to offer the nutrients that your plants need in order to, sorry about that, I'll wait for them to get on the elevator. Okay. It's going to be what the components of the vermicast is going to be what helps make sure that the nutrients is readily available for your plants. And then with your vermicast or vermicomposting, you don't have to worry so much about the pH balance, where you do have to worry about it, but there are going to be signs that tell you if your worm bin is too acidic or too alkaline, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But yeah, so those are the major differences between composting and vermicomposting and vermicast. So let's talk a little bit about how to get started with worm farming or vermicomposting in general. So your curiosity is everything. The first thing that's going to be super important is to just simply do your research, know what you're getting yourself into. I like to talk about vermicomposting and like having a worm farm. I like to talk about it like you're adopting a new pet. So when people purchase their worms from me, I kind of take them through this whole like adoption process so that they get in their mind that this is a living, breathing organism that you are now responsible for taking care of. And of course, we all have these moments where we slip up and our whole worm farm just dies. It's happened to me as well. But I do like to get people kind of in the mindset that you're working with life. And so I like to set the tone to have a certain respect for starting your journey and taking that journey seriously. So do all the research that you need to do. I am happy to be a resource for you all. If you have questions, after this presentation and into the future, I can always be there to answer whatever questions you guys have about vermicomposting. But research is super important. After you've done your research, you're gonna wanna make sure that you pick out what type of bin you're gonna use, where you're gonna keep your worms, all of these things. After you've done all that and you've got everything planned out, you're gonna go ahead and purchase your worms. I do suggest red wigglers for vermicomposting, although there are other types of worms that you can use. And it kind of just depends on where you live too, because hotter climates are going to be more inclined to purchase like African night crawlers. But if you're in a space like Colorado where the temperature is highly unpredictable every single day, red wigglers are going to be your best bet. Not only because of their hardiness and how resilient they are, but they are a true composting worm. They are the composting worm. It is their purpose in life. What the Most High created them to do was to compost organic material. So they're going to be a lot more efficient at vermicomposting than most of your other worms that you'll find out there on the market. So once you get your worms and your bin and you know what you're going to use for your bedding and you've got some kitchen scraps in the freezer ready to feed them, you're going to get all that set up and put them in the space that you want for them to be in. So one of the things that I like to tell people once they've got everything set up is that you'll want to keep your worms in a space that you're okay with leaving the light on, because worms are animals. They like to explore and they're going to follow moisture. It's just in their nature to do so. But when we keep the light on, it makes it so that they'll want to stay away from the surface and they'll not want to explore because they will explore. So keeping the light on, it just keeps them down into the soil. They don't like the light. They're super sensitive to it. In fact, it will paralyze them, like the intensity from like the sun. Will paralyze them after about 30 minutes. And that's why you see little worms like dried up and crusty on the sidewalk after the rain, because they got paralyzed from the sun and couldn't make it back to the grass. So keeping the light on will help to keep them down into the bin until they completely get settled into their new home and they know where they're at. So in terms of choosing your worm bin, there are a wide variety of bins that you can choose from on the market. I am a fan of making your own homemade bin, just because with that you have more control over the amount of space that you're going to allot to your worm farm, whereas your worm towers and your continuous flow through systems, they kind of require the amount of space that they require. So I like to stick with homemade bins just because we can design the bins that work best for us. One of the downfalls I would say to making homemade bins, if it's just a bin itself, is when it comes time to harvest, that tends to be a pretty tedious process, which we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But The only downside to like just using a bin itself is the harvesting process. Other than that, it's going to be super efficient. It's going to get the job done. Your worms are going to be happy, and it's going to be in the space that you feel comfortable allotting to your worms. Then there are your worm tower bins, which you can DIY one of these bins as well. In my experience, I've never used one for myself, just because I've heard so many horror stories about all the things that can go wrong in a system, and I'm just not willing to risk my worms' lives or like my time to trying to figure out a worm tower. So, but that is one of the options that you have available to you. They have some really cute ones out there on the market. And I just haven't heard of one that's sufficient enough and stress-free enough that has made me want to try it. Your continuous flow-through systems, I really like this idea because it's pretty much like using a bin, but at the bottom of the system, there's kind of like this chute that allows for the vermicast itself to fall through, but will keep all of your organic material and your worms at the top part of the system. So another kind of fun fact about your composting worms, if you use rat wigglers, because they are composting worms, they live in the top 6 inches of the soil, so that way they can come up from the bottom and eat whatever organic material is in the bin, and then their worm castings drop down to the bottom. So that's the whole design behind the continuous flow through systems, is that those worms will be up in the top 6 inches of the material in the bin, and then their worm castings drop down so that you can just open the little chute and the vermicast will come down through there. I also get a lot of questions about, can I have my worms in my garden bed? Absolutely. I think that this is like, I don't know, for me, it makes me feel like they are as close to nature as possible because they're out in the garden. And they're still doing the job that you need for them to do. Some people just let their worms kind of roam free in the bin, which is natural. It will happen even if you do have some type of contraption in there. But then there are other people that have little contraptions. They're like baskets or tubs that they've drilled holes in, and they've dug a hole in the garden and placed the container into the garden, and then they just pop the top open, feed the worms that way, and then cover it up with a little bit of bedding, and then the worms kind of still work through and process materials through the container that they've placed into the actual garden. So there are both of those options for composting or vermicomposting inside your garden bed. They can be free to move about the cabin however they want, or you can have a little contraption there where they can have a focused area of where you'll place your casting or place the organic material that you want for them to process through. Maven, turn that down, please. Thank you. Let's see, what else did I want to say about that? So if you are just going to allow them to kind of have free range of your garden bed, you'll want to make sure that when you plant your plants, that you leave kind of designated areas for your kitchen scraps to be dropped down into. You don't want to have to like dig up the roots of your plants to bury kitchen scraps. So that's something to be mindful of if you don't have like an actual container for them to come and get the kitchen scraps out of. A lot of people also ask, can you use the composting bins, the little tumbler I don't know the appropriate word for it. But the tumbler composter, that might be the name of it. But I typically do not suggest using those, just because if we think about a worm in their natural habitat, the ground, the earth is stable and stationary, versus being in a container that's like tumbling. Your worms are not going to be happy. They like to be in a space that is, I don't want to say compacted, but they like to be in a space that resembles earth, which, like I said, is it's solid and stable for them. If you do use one of the rolling composters, another issue that I'm not too sure of, because I just kind of discourage people altogether from using them, is like the airflow. I know that it does have airflow in there, but I'm not sure if it's enough airflow for worms and microbial life to be able to thrive and survive the way that they should. Let's see. Oh, one of my favorite things to encourage people to do before they go out and purchase a composting bin is to get creative and upcycle whatever material you might have or your neighbor might have. I have people that have made their worm farm out of an old deep freezer. I have people that just use old totes that they have laying around. And even if you don't have the top for those, that's totally fine. You'll just want to make sure that you add some layer of covering to keep the moisture locked into the bit, not locked in, but allow for the moisture to come in and flow through as it needs to. So I always encourage people to get creative, let yourself explore and find things to create a worm bin out of. The most important thing is that it's going to hold your worms, their castings. It's going to allow proper oxygen exchange to happen. Other than that, vermicomposting is super simple and really practical for most people to do. So it also kind of creates this really beautiful science project for children and the youth to get involved in, because they're taking something that seemingly had no life left to it, but then they're bringing it back and using it for something that is going to help the environment and their garden thrive. So there's that upside, that land stewardship part that we spoke about just a moment ago. Just calling us to really make sure that we're using what we already have to create something new and something that's going to be beneficial. So let's talk a little bit about the vermicomposting process itself. Like, how does it work? What are we doing? Like I said, vermicomposting is a closed loop system, which means we don't need to go outside of, once we have things set up, we don't need to go outside of our homes to sustain our vermicomposting system, unless we're like borrowing leaves from a neighbor. But aside from that, everything that we need to take care of our worms and to create a happy, healthy vermicomposting system, we can find out in nature, or we can find with our kitchen scraps. So the first step in vermicomposting is we're going to plant the seed, we're going to let it grow, and we're going to nurture that seed, water it, give it food, and then it's going to be time to harvest that plant. We're going to consume the plant that we've harvested, and then we're going to take our kitchen scraps and put that into our worm bin. Our worms are then going to process through that material, and as they process through that, they're going to poop it out. And once they poop it out, it'll be ready to be harvested and taken out into the garden to apply back into the garden. So it's just this beautiful cycle that is going to just continuously help us to grow healthy, strong, resilient gardens, plants, and food that is going to in turn come right back and nourish our bodies. And it really is this simple. I know vermicomposting can kind of seem like one of those things that is challenging, just because you hear all of the horror stories that have happened, the smells, the effort that has to go towards it. But if you be mindful and take care of your bin, you don't have to worry about smells or things like that. While we're on the topic of smells, the way to make sure that we don't have to deal with the smells of rotting, decomposing food is we cover our kitchen scraps up with at least 2 inches of bedding. That keeps the smell, because if you dig into your bin and your kitchen scraps are in the middle of decomposing, you will smell kind of the stench of decomposition. But because it's covered up with that carbon, the bedding, you don't have to worry about those smells leaching out into your home or whatever space your vermicomposting bin is in. Another thing that you can write down is that if there's ever an issue in the bin, carbon, your browns are going to be a lifesaver. If there's a smell, just add browns. If there is too much moisture, just add browns. Almost all issues in your composting system are going to be resolved by adding more carbon into it. We want to keep about an 80-20 ratio in terms of our browns and greens when it comes to composting. Some people like to go 70-30, but when we're just getting started out with vermicomposting, I like to say 80-20, just so that we can keep things nice and balanced and we don't have to worry too much about all the issues that can come with overfeeding your worms. So now that you guys kind of know like the process of vermicomposting and the benefits of it, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can use the end product of being such a great steward over this land. And so one of the main ways that you can use the vermicast, which is worm poop essentially, but also mixed with that microbial life, is just put the raw worm castings into your garden. I think I posted a video on that last week, so you can see just how simple it is to just take the castings and mix them, kind of gently massage them into the soil, and then give it a nice watering in, and that will help for the nutrients and that microbiology to work its way down into the soil and into the root system, so that your plants can uptake what's needed. And then that microbiology will just be in there to kind of help break other material down that's in your garden bed. You can also make a compost tea. You can do just like you would typically make your tea. You just put some in a bag and let it sit for about 24 hours. Or you can aerate this tea, which is going to give a nice boost to that microbial life, which is the main benefit of the vermicast. So you can make a tea with it. You can use it as a foliar spray, which is basically just hitting your plants with this spray. I typically suggest using your tea, especially as a foliar spray early in the morning or kind of like in the evening when the sun has already reached its highest intensity, or before it gets to that point, just because we don't want to cause burns on the plants. But yes, you can use it as a foliar spray that's going to give your plants some nutrients essentially through their skin, through their foliage. It's going to also help with like pests and things like that. the foliar spray is. So you can use it that way. You can also take the raw castings and use those raw castings as a way to start your seeds. Seeds absolutely love vermicast. In fact, when you are, we'll just say we have some tomatoes that have gone bad. We put those into the vermicomposting systems, and the next thing we know, we have like 20 tomato sprouts in there, and they're like thriving. So your seeds will absolutely love to start in vermicast because it offers like the perfect levels of moisture, but then it also has that nutrients in there. So it's a great way to start your seeds and get things going with your seeds. You can make different soil mixes. Give me just 1 minute. I'm gonna let these people pass. So another way that we use vermicast is we make different soil mixes. So we do seed starting soil mixes where we just use our vermicast, cocoa coir, some perlite, and maybe a little bit of other organic amendments to create different mixes for the garden, potting soil mixes, I should say. And then we have another level where our plants are growing, so it'll be a little heavier in the nitrogen. And then we have our final potting mix that's a little bit heavier with the phosphorus and potassium to help with root development. And then when it's time for them to come into their flowering or fruiting stage, they have all the nutrients there that they need for that specific time of life that they are in. One of the things that people don't know is that you can use vermicast to nourish your grass, your lawn. Although I try as much as possible to get people to stay away from like your conventional typical grass lawn, Kentucky bluegrass lawn, and try to get people to tap in more to the micro clovers and wildflower lawns. You can add vermicast to your grass, and it will help to keep it nice and green, keep it nice and healthy, and things like that. You don't have to worry so much about like ticks and other pests that can be attracted to your regular conventional lawn. So those are different ways that you can use vermicast. Some things that are super important to remember is that your vermicomposting system is an ecosystem. Your worms are not the only things that are living in this habitat. There are microscopic little bugs and insects and living organisms that are down in your bin. But not only that, there are also other creatures that you might see. So for example, there might be springtails or composting mites. These two specifically are almost certainly going to be in your composting system. And it's not really a matter of how like to get them out. It's just a matter of keeping them in check so that we know that the living conditions for our worms, which is most important, is appropriate and they're going to be able to thrive. So if you see a whole bunch of potworms, which are little tiny white worms, you're going to know that the living conditions or the conditions inside your bin are a little too acidic, and you'll want to make sure that you add more carbon so that the carbon can help to balance things out in the bin. Your composting mites are there also to kind of do a job. They're there to help break things down. Like I said, this is an ecosystem, and these organisms are going to recognize like, oh, this is like a space where I can come and find food. So they're going to do what they're sent to do or were created to do, and they're going to help to break things down. You'll also see springtails in your bin. Typically when I see springtails, and it's not like a huge population of springtails, this signifies to me that the bin is healthy and is thriving, because those springtails, they come in, they're going to help to break down organic material. If you do start to see that, like, well, it's like a whole bunch of them in there, I usually just try to bait them with some of their favorite foods, or I'll just take a big scoop of wherever they're at and throw it like out in the grass, just to help control their population. But other pests, so when we talk about pests, we want to think about like gnats and like larvae of beetles and flies. Those are, I do consider pests, and those should not really be in your bin. If your bin is outside, covering your kitchen scraps with carbon as much as possible is going to be super important, because those bugs are going to be attracted to decomposing food. So you just want to make sure that things are covered up, so that they're not attracted to your bin. But all in all, just keeping in mind that your vermicomposting system is a living, breathing ecosystem, is going to be super important, especially when you start to see things like the composting mites, the springtails, the potworms. And then also with those three specifically, it's important to know that when you put those into your garden, they're not going to harm your plants or the root system, because they are specifically for composting things that have already died. So they're not going to destroy anything in your garden that has life and is still living and thriving. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about feeding. The best rule of thumb that I give all of my clients, all of the people that I mentor, is if you see food in the bin from your last feeding, do not feed again until that material is almost completely processed through. Overfeeding your worm bin is like one of the most irritating, if I can be honest, things that can happen, because it causes a lot of issues that can just really be prevented or avoided. So just making sure that, like, if there's a little bit of the last feeding, it's okay to go ahead and feed in a different spot, but you'll want to make sure that it's mostly completely processed through, just so that we're keeping your worms healthy, and we don't have to deal with things like protein poisoning and super acidic conditions inside your worm bin. And then lastly, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the living conditions inside your worm bin. Worms are, when it comes to like temperatures and things that they like, they are very similar to humans. Worms they can't really regulate their temperatures. And just because they don't really have natural systems in place to regulate their temperatures like we as humans do. So they tend to prefer a temperature that we prefer. So like nice low 70s, that's just me. But I love to be in like temperatures from like 65 to 75 is the perfect range for me. Your worms are gonna also love that range. Although if you do get some red wigglers, they, like I said, they're pretty hardy, so they can handle temperatures as long as things aren't frozen in the bin. They will typically survive, and they can handle all the way up to about 90, 95-ish on the hotter scale of things. But keeping them in the shade, using a water bottle to kind of keep the bins cool, frozen water bottle, and you leave the top on, set that in the bin. If your bin's outside during the summer months, then that will also help to keep the bin nice and cool for them. In the winter, I typically suggest I really spoiled my worms, y'all. I'm not gonna lie to you. I had their bins covered, um, wrapped in a blanket, and then I had a bunch of just dead foliage layered on top of the bin, kind of in a way to make sure that there was still space for oxygen to come in. I layered the foliage in there, and then I covered that foliage up with a layer of burlap, and they survived the winter here in Colorado. So yeah, your worms can be really resilient, especially if you have the red wigglers. But yeah, as far as bedding material, you can use anything from shredded brown paper bag, pre-composted material, coco coir. Some people use sphagnum peat moss and things like that, but I typically don't suggest it just because it's not sustainable, it's not renewable, and it's not gonna do, it's kind of gonna be opposite of what you want to do when you have a worm bin, because it's not a sustainable source. You can use dead tree leaves. With grass clippings, you kind of have to be careful because fresh grass clippings will heat your bin up. Let's see. So yeah, so you can use all of these things as bedding. And then as far as moisture level, you'll want to have that to be like a wrung out dish sponge. You don't want it to be too wet. You don't want it to be too dry. You kind of want it to be right at that sweet spot where they can still move around freely and enjoy their living conditions. I think that's all I want to say about their living conditions. Yes. So if you're going to have them in the house, you'll just kind of want to put them in a spot that's nice, cool, and dark, and they're going to thrive. As long as they have food in the bin, they won't like wander as much. Like I said, they are animals. They love to explore. So I like to put like eggshell cartons in their bin to just kind of act as like a little playground for them to kind of roam and explore and things like that. If you have them outside, you'll always want to make sure that they're in the shade and protected from the sun as much as possible. And then depending on the season, you'll want to kind of adjust accordingly to if it's a hot day or if it's like a freezing day. But I do typically suggest, if you can, having your worm farm inside, just so you don't have to worry so much about those other considerations of them being outside. And so that is all I have for my presentation. Vermicomposting is a super fun and simple way to divert your waste practically, and the benefits that it'll have in your garden are immeasurable. So I typically suggest vermicomposting for everyone that's growing and producing food. You can do it on a level that you feel comfortable with, but also if you need more vermicompost because you have a huge garden, you can scale it up to that. Or if you want to keep it small and simple and sweet, you can keep it small. So yes, that is my presentation. Let me figure this out. Okay, so now we can go ahead and I think I stopped sharing my screen and we can go into questions that you all might have. And sorry, let me kind of scan through and see if there's any questions.
Didn't see any questions in the chat.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So you had earlier had mentioned that in order to prevent exploring, that you needed light to keep them in a well-lit area, and then I guess at the end I got the impression that protecting them from the heat and the sunlight was pretty important as well. So I guess I'm struggling to kind of reconcile those two pieces. Can you help tease that out for me?
Of course. So, so the light, to keep them from exploring, that's kind of just in the beginning, because when you get them and you're putting them in a new environment, they are uncomfortable. So it's like, I don't know where I'm at, like what's going on in here. So they'll kind of roam and explore. They just follow the moisture in the bin. And so when you put the house light over the bin, it just kind of encourages them to stay down into the soil. But in any case, you really want to keep them out of like direct sunlight, because that will paralyze them and potentially kill them. So when I was speaking about having a light over them, when you first set up your bin, it's just like a little small house light that you're gonna place over them, just for like a day or two, so they can kind of settle into their bedding. And then you'll remove the light and, you know, put them in their permanent home or permanent area where you're gonna have their bin.
Gotcha. I definitely missed that, like that transition. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Morgan, did you have a question?
Yes, and forgive me if my answer is a little shoddy, right? Netflix. So as I understand it, this is a process that you would do indoors because of the sunlight issue. So once you, I guess, harvest the worm castings, is that something I would add directly to like my compost pile, or would I add it to my garden bed?
So for the first part of your question, you can compost inside or outside. There are a bunch of people that do it outside. I just want to be clear about that. But you can add the vermicast directly to your garden. There are people that do add vermicast to their pre-composted material, just because that microbial life will then go in there and kind of break down the rest of like the pre-composted material, but it can go directly out into your garden.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate you not only the presentation, which I think was fantastic, also saying that you could do this process outdoors too. Because I don't know. At first, I'm a little overwhelmed. I'm like, I don't think I can take care of another living thing right now, but I am definitely interested. But I imagine I take certain precautions with some blocking them if I decide to do that composting outside.
Yeah, people are definitely more comfortable doing it outside sometimes, especially when they're getting started. But yeah, you're welcome for answering the question. Sorry.
No, you did. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
If you had to give I don't know if it's a consistent time frame of how long it takes for the worms to like process through things, like I feel like that the answer is probably like it depends, but so if that's the answer, I totally get it. But I was curious if you had like a sense of like how long it takes for the worms to go through like a feeding or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to go through a feeding, it kind of depends on how big your clue is. A clue is just kind of like a herd of goats or cows. Worms are called clues. It depends on the size of your clue. So they can process anywhere from half their weight in material every day. So if you have a pound of worms, they're going to eat through about a half a pound of material every day. For your complete vermicomposting system, it typically takes them about 3 months to process through, to process through the entire bin. And then if you're wanting to harvest the whole bin at once, I typically just tell people to do it like every 3 months, because it's going to get to the point where you can't really differentiate bedding from poop, depending on what you use. I personally use a mixture of pre-composted material and coco coir. So it's like by the time things are done, I don't really know what's poop and what's not. So every 3 months is going to be, you know, the time frame of when you'll harvest your full bed. But then feeding specifically, it kind of just depends on how much you feed them, because there are people that feed every day, and then there are people like me, I feed once a week, and I'll feed like a 5-pound block every week, and they process through it. And then by the next day, I feed Sundays. The next Sunday, that food is gone. And then you can take that little scoop of castings if you want, or take a handful and use it if you need to. So it kind of just depends. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Do you have a recommendation on like how, and would you mind repeating the name of the group, the herd of worms, what that's called again?
Oh yes. So the group of worms it's called a clue, CLEW.
Clue.
And
A clue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Clue. Yes. And then I'm sorry, what was the other part to your question?
So the question, I guess, is like how that was actually a really helpful answer about like half their weight. So a pound will go through half a pound. Like how big of a clue should people have, I guess? And it's only just me and my partner, really.
Okay. So for you and your partner, it depends on how much kitchen scraps you produce. I typically tell people to start with like half a pound, to kind of see how they process through the way that you feed them and then the material that you feed them. Also, while we're talking about feeding, the smaller that you make your feedings, as far as like size wise, the quicker your clue will process through the material. So let's just say I have a whole bunch of strawberries and tomatoes that went bad in the kitchen. I'm gonna blend that up and then pour a little bit of eggshell powder over that so that they can process through it quicker. Worms, they don't have teeth. Their mouths are like little straws. So the smaller you can and finer you can make their food, the kitchen scraps, the quicker they'll be able to process through. And then that eggshell will help to push the food through their systems.
Okay.
Yeah. So
sorry, I have a couple other questions that kind of came up, if that's okay.
no, you can ask as many questions as you need to.
This is great. I learned what a clue was, first of all, but so many other things as well. But this might sound like a funny question, but low-key, I just don't know. So you start off with your pound, your clue, that's a pound. And let's say that like you're feeling like that could be increased, you know, depending on like the, you know, just the volume that you have going. There isn't going to be an issue with introducing like a different group of worms with the original group of worms, right? Like we don't have like territorial behavior of earthworms going on here.
That's a good question. So in my experience, they don't really have worm beef. Yes, I hope there's no worm beef. In my experience, no. But when I introduce one clue to another clue, I make sure I put them in a system that is going to be big enough for everybody to grow and thrive. So you want to have at least 1 square foot of space and bedding per 1 pound clue. So 1 pound of worms, you'll want at least 1 square foot for them. Now, in that square foot, that clue is not going to grow very much. Just because there's not enough space in there for them. But I'll just give you an example. So I had like one of those big normal size like storage bins that people will store like costumes or whatever in. I had one of those. It already had like 2 pounds of worms in it. And then I was taking some of my other worms from another bin because they had outgrown the smaller bin. So I took about half of that, which was like a pound, and I put that pound into the bin that had the 2 pounds of worms already in it. There's enough space for all the worms. Everybody can grow and thrive in there. And that bin did great. It processed through food really well. I did have to split it up because the clues, it outgrew the bin. But in my experience, as long as there's enough space for more worms to be added, I don't think there's any worm beef going on in there. But I have done some research, and I've heard that there can be. I can't imagine how, because worms are so peaceful. It's like, how are you fighting? You don't have arms or teeth, so I don't know. But I think as long as there's enough space for everybody, then they'll be fine. And I just kind of set them like in one area of the bin, and then kind of let them go out and explore the rest of the bin. Oh, that sparked another tidbit for me to give you guys, but I cannot remember. It'll come back to me though. So yeah. Oh, I was gonna say, if your worms are outgrowing their current system, they will explore quite a bit. And then you'll also notice like your bigger worms start to die off, because when worms don't have enough space for the clue to grow, and it's just innate in them for them to eat, mate, and produce more worms. When there's not enough space for their young to survive, the older, more mature worms will start to die off, so that their young can have a better chance at having enough space and food to grow and thrive. So that's something else that you'll want to keep in mind. Your clue is going to double in size every 3 months, as long as there's enough space. So about every 3 months when you harvest, you'll just want to know that either I need to have time to set up another worm bin for this new amount of worms that has been produced, or you'll want to, prepare to give it away to someone if you don't want to either expand the size of your bin or create another bin that's the same size, but yeah, it'll just give you an additional bin.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a follow-up question based on what you just described. So as the clue gets bigger, when you're saying set up another bin, that means you can separate them and they'll be fine, being split into 2 groups?
Yeah. So also another thing to kind of keep in mind is that worms, they don't process life the same way that we do. All they know is that they have these other little beings that they help to create, and that they kind of work in partnership with to get their daily task of eating material done. So they do fine with being split up. I will say when you do split them up, you might notice them kind of, like I said, exploring because they're in a new environment. But they'll be okay with being split up from the rest of their clue.
Okay, another question. So I'm really interested in doing this.
Okay.
I've been starting like composting slowly. So I got a bokashi because I live in an apartment. So I've been doing that. And someone else told me like, oh, you should get into vermiculture and like vermicomposting because, you have like a smaller space.
Mhm.
I just think I don't know enough. So I'm wondering, I went to your website, things like that. I'm just wondering what else you could offer, or what do you offer people who are trying to do this for the first time? Is there a bit of hand holding? You guys have a list of like what to buy, and then just kind of like what to do? Because this was a great overview, but I'm still like, I don't know what my first step is because
Mhm.
it's just a lot of info.
Yeah, so your first step is going to be to decide what type of system you want. So if you want to just do like a regular bin and you're not like super selective on what type of bin you have, we do offer just a basic bin that you can get started with over on my website. Um, and yeah, you'll just get started with your bin. You'll figure out what type of bedding you're gonna use. If you want to use coco coir, we offer that on my site as well. But you can also just go out in nature, get a bunch of leaves, crush them up really good, get them nice and moist, and use that as your bedding. And then get your worms and get started. Once you have your bin set up, I do usually tell people to have your bin set up and pre-moisten and things like that for at least a week before you get your worms, just so that any toxins that may be in the water or whatnot can burn off. And then your worms will be coming into a system that is also not completely like inert. You want for there to be that bacteria that's kind of like marinated off in there. So yeah, the first step is to just get your bin, figure out the bedding type that you're going to use, and then get your worms. And then from there, you'll feed. You're welcome, Crystal. And then from there, you'll wait like a day or two after you have things set up, and you can go ahead and do your first feeding. I will say I do offer mentorship and hand holding, helping you through the process. Any questions you have, I'm here. I always have my phone beside me. In fact, I had a mentor that I saw last weekend, and she was like, I think it's time to harvest. And she went home and brought her bin back, and we kind of looked through it and saw what was going on. And she's doing a great job. So I'm here to help you through the process every step of the way. Sister Ote is also extremely knowledgeable when it comes to vermicomposting. So you have her as well. And so yeah, I'm always here to help you through the process. I know it's a lot of information, but it's actually a pretty simple and practical way to compost, especially with you being in an apartment.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That was really excellent, which I knew that already before you came.
Yay.
So happy that you've been with us for many years now. You've been showing up and being a part of what the Georgia Green Project is doing. And I really appreciate that, your professionalism.
Thank you.
And for all these years, I can see she has new information. So that's fun for me too, right? Because we're always going to continue to learn. So you all, as you know, you'll get the chat information from today's seminar. There will be the links to her. I put the Facebook in there, the Instagram and the TikTok. And then you will see the website. Okay, the recording will be uploaded to YouTube. Usually takes me a couple of days to get it up, but this will be available for the public to gather this information. I'm really excited about that. We're almost at that hour. I just wanted to know, let's see if there's any closing remarks you wanted to make.
No, I just want to say thank you for always thinking of me, to be a part of your journey and to be, involved in the process of educating people and helping people to create that sovereignty and that self-sufficiency. So I truly appreciate you.
Appreciate you. So there's a myriad, she does more than just the composting. And there is going to be a moment where all of you who are in the beta group and our guests who have entrepreneurial endeavors, where you all will be able to share that information with each other so we can also continue to build community wealth.
Yes.
Start with this community of practice of, urban gardeners. So I appreciate you all so much. You know the routine. Defina is new to you, but for those of you who are still here, what we do is we just type in one word in the comments on how you're feeling right now. Any word, whatever you're feeling, just type it in the comments, and that's pretty much our benediction, how we sign off on our seminars. I see motivated. I love the fact that I learned grateful, inspired is me because I learned more information.
That's what I was about to say. That's what I typed into.
Yeah.
Thank you all who joined as well, for being a part of this.
So listen, hang on just a minute. Don't hang up yet. Everyone else, thank you so much for being here. We will see you again next week. Same time, same place. Appreciate y'all.